All right, Alexander. So the big news is that Lenin has returned to Petrograd. We'll refer it as St. Petersburg, as you have said in many programs before. We'll call it St. Petersburg. It's a traditional name. And he's back. And we hinted at this in our last video that Lenin would be trying to make his way back, as undoubtedly he sees an opening, an opportunity to seize power, because for all intents and purposes, it does look like we have absolute chaos and a massive power vacuum now that the Tsar has abdicated. We're about a month, a couple of weeks, a month after the Tsar's abdication, and here we are with Lenin back in St. Petersburg. No one really knows who's running what, and as we said, as we closed out our last video, the stage is set for his triumphant return, and we called it. He did return. So how did he end up in St. Petersburg? That is the question.
Yeah, absolutely. He has returned, and his return, by the way, is electrifying the entire political situation in Russia in exactly the way that we essentially predicted. But how did he return? Because, of course, when the Tsar abdicated, he was in Switzerland. He was near Zurich. He was far away from the scene of the action. And, of course, there's a war going on. Germany is at war with Russia. How does he get to St. Petersburg? The only way he can get to St. Petersburg, the only way he can get back to Russia, is by crossing German territory. And of course, Germany is at war with Russia, and Lenin is a Russian national. So supposedly, and in theory, he is an enemy national. You would have thought that the Germans would not let him pass through their country to Russia. If he ever did try to get to Russia across Germany, the Germans, you might have expected, would arrest him. Well, Lenin is not the kind of man who's going to let a mere thing like a world war stand in his way when the possibility of seizing power, of gaining power in Russia, is there for the taking. And what we saw happen is a classic example of Lenin's utter ruthlessness, his willingness to do things which nobody else would even consider doing in order to achieve his objective. He used an intermediary, a very peculiar character called Parvus, or help hand. This man gives himself different names. He's sometimes calls himself Parvus. He sometimes calls himself help hand. Anyway, he's some kind of a so-called revolutionary socialist in Germany. Parvus is also a multimillionaire, an arms dealer, and somebody who has some kind of connections with German intelligence. So he's a very weird character, very strange character, but the kind of person who, operates behind the scenes. Anyway, Lenin has been in contact with Parvus. It's fairly widely known that Lenin, through Parvus, has been getting money from the Germans. I mean, the Germans have provided Lenin with some funding because, of course, Lenin has been pursuing anti-war policies in Russia and anti-war propaganda in Russia. And from the German point of view, that is a good thing. Anyway, through the agency of Parvus, Lenin negotiated with the Germans, and the Germans agreed that he should be allowed to travel across Russia in what is called across Germany in what is called a sealed train. In other words, a train which he and his associates cannot leave, and in which no German can enter. They travel across Germany into Scandinavia, through Finland, and through Finland into St. Petersburg. So it's a deal which, as I said, perhaps no other Russian politician in this kind of situation would have undertaken. A agreement, if you like, with the enemy of your country in order to get home. And Lenin did it. He travelled through Germany. He reached Finland. He went through this extraordinary railway station in Helsinki, which is built in red granite. It's an extraordinary railway station built by Nicholas when he was Tsar, because, of course, remember, Finland was part of the Russian Empire. It's still connected to Russia in some form, even though the Finns are now talking about breaking away. In theory, it's got some kind of autonomy. It's connected to Russia through the person of the Tsar. It doesn't really think of itself as part of Russia. But anyway, Lenin passes through Helsinki. He goes through this railway station. He then travels to St. Petersburg. And there are reports circulating that the provisional government, this peculiar entity that Rodzianko, the Speaker of the Duma, and other liberal politicians in Russia have conjured up out of the whole cloth, this provisional government, which has not been elected by the Duma or appointed by the Tsar, which operates in a legal vacuum, but which still has some ability to control the ministries and ability to control the police, that the provisional government would arrest Lenin on arrival. Because after all, Lenin has just done a deal with Russia's enemy, the country Germany, with which Russia is at war. And there were expectations that when Lenin arrived in St. Petersburg at the Finland station, the police would be waiting for him and would arrest him. Well, here we see both Lenin's force of personality, his confidence as a politician, and his understanding of the weakness of his opponents. Because, of course, if he tried to pull a trick like this, whilst Nicholas was still Tsar, the police would certainly have been there at the station waiting to arrest him. But the new government, Rodzianko, who's not actually technically a member of the government, but he's still floating around in some way, Lvov, Prince Lvov, this weak character who runs the government, Kerensky, this ambitious politician who's supposed to be a major figure within the government. Nobody quite understands precisely what his role is. They didn't have the courage to send the police to the Finland station in St. Petersburg when Lenin's train arrived. Instead, the Bolshevik organization in St. Petersburg organized a massive reception for Lenin. There were workers there. There were sailors from the fleet. Remember what we discussed in our previous program, that the fleet has mutinied and many of the sailors have murdered their officers. There were sailors from the fleet. There was a band, and Lenin arrived. He gave a forceful speech, very brief speech, and he is back in St. Petersburg. He got a rapturous reception from his supporters, not what you would have expected of a person who's just done a deal with the enemy of his country. And there was the soldiers and the sailors and the workers at the Finland station sang the Marseillaise. This isn't the French national anthem, it's a Russian revolutionary anthem to the music of the French national anthem, the Marseillaise. And Lenin then went from there to the palace of Matilda Ksesinskaya, the prima ballerina of the Imperial Ballet, which the Bolsheviks have simply marched in and taken over and have announced that they've expropriated it and made it their headquarters. So he is now ensconced in the palace, or rather, it's not actually a palace, it's a big Art Nouveau house of the prima ballerina of the Imperial Ballet, the woman who was formerly the mistress of Nicholas, Nicholas's mistress before he married, and he's been able to arrive in St. Petersburg. The Germans facilitated his arrival. The authorities, as we supposedly should call them, they did absolutely nothing to impede him. They didn't take any kind of step to arrest him. He is now in St. Petersburg. And as we'll discuss shortly, he is already capitalizing on the mistakes that the provisional government that Rodzianko, Lvov, Milyukov, Kerensky have been making, and he's quite openly manoeuvring to take power.
Okay, so before we get to the Germans, why the Germans gave him passage, because I think there's a lot that we can unpack there. Real quick question: why didn't they arrest him? Why do you think Kerensky and Rodzianko and this provisional government? I don't even know if it's a government. This provisional structure didn't arrest Lenin. Is it because they know that deep down inside they know that they don't have the authority, or the people will not abide by their orders? I mean, is there that sense of understanding that we really don't have authority, and we're afraid to give such orders? I mean, I'm just trying to figure it out. If it was someone with authority, like the Tsar, if the Tsar was still Tsar, and he understood that he had the authority to give these orders, he would say arrest Lenin, and the police would carry out his orders, and that would be that. That's a functioning government right there. But it seems like they're not confident in their own structure to have taken action against Lenin. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, exactly. I mean, you're absolutely right. The fact that they didn't arrest Lenin on arrival, with Lenin, by the way, making it absolutely open fact that he wants to overthrow this government. The fact that they didn't arrest this man who's coming to overthrow them, and who is, let's say it straightforwardly, I mean, in league, or has been in league with the country's enemy. What it shows is that there is no functional government in Russia. And here we've got to discuss, and I think it's important at this point to say a few things about the situation both in St. Petersburg and in Russia at the moment. We discussed in our previous program how when Nicholas abdicated, the liberals who dominate the government ensured that the parliament, Russia's parliament, the Duma, was not reconvened, so that there is no parliament in Russia at the moment, because only the Tsar has the power to reconvene the Duma. He offered to reconvene it. They rejected his offer. The Tsar also offered to appoint the provisional government, which he had the right to do, the new government, but they rejected that offer as well. And they blocked the proposal to make the Tsar's brother, Grand Prince Michael, Tsar in his place. So we have no Tsar, no parliament, and a government that has just been, which has simply appointed itself, that has no actual legal authority. Now, that is bad enough already. But then they made a disastrous move, or to be more precise, Rodzianko, the speaker of what we must now call the former Duma. Remember, he has no formal legal position anymore, but he headed for a brief period what he liked to call the provisional committee of the State Duma, whatever that means. Anyway, Rodzianko, in that capacity, which isn't even a real capacity, he then gave an order. He has no right to give orders to the military, which mutinied against the Tsar, all these soldiers in the streets of St. Petersburg. He gave them an order telling them to return to barracks and obey their officers. Now, they might have had that order, for example, from the military. You might have expected that the chief of staff of the Russian army, General Alexeyev, might have given an order like that. It might have been an order transmitted via the chain of command. But Rodzianko took it upon himself to give that order as if he was entitled or empowered to give orders like that to the military. Well, all that did was that it created an enormous backlash amongst the soldiers in the capital. They got the sense that Rodzianko, who they don't have any time or respect for, is making some kind of bid for power, and that he wants to lock them up again in their barracks and perhaps even, do things. There's even wild stories that Rodzianko did it in order to bring back the Tsar. I mean, this is nonsense, but, you get these stories like this circulating. And remember, soldiers, many of the soldiers have little understanding of politics. And it's understandable, perhaps, that these kind of rumors circulate. And you can be sure the Bolsheviks are working hard amongst the soldiers to circulate those kind of rumors. So anyway, Rodzianko is absolutely cack-handed and idiotic order provoked the setting up in St. Petersburg. And again, one would love to know who was behind the decision to set this up, of something known as the Petrograd, the St. Petersburg, the Petrograd Council of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. Now, this is an institution that has just suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but which is inviting representatives from all the big factories and also representatives from all the big army units in St. Petersburg. Now, it's important to stress representatives from the rank and file soldiers, not from the officers. And the very first thing this council of workers and soldiers deputies did is that they issued something called General Order Number 1. And General Order Number 1 says that soldiers should only obey their officers if the orders given by the officers are cleared by this council of workers and soldiers deputies, and that the soldiers should set up cells within each individual unit, and that these cells should elect representatives to this council of workers and soldiers deputies, and that these cells should take control of the weapons that these military units have, that they should take over control of the armories. And the result is that military discipline in St. Petersburg has now totally collapsed. The military units in the city, all the soldiers are no longer obeying their officers. They all say that they're taking only their orders only from this council of workers' deputies. Cells are being created within the military units. They are challenging the authority of the officers, and they're taking control of the weapons of the military units. And it's getting even worse, because though the St. Petersburg Council of Soldiers and Workers Deputies is only confined to St. Petersburg, what we're now hearing is that people up and down Russia, workers in the various cities, again, undoubtedly, I suspect, influenced in doing this by Lenin's organization, and also in the military units across the army, including on the front line, are copying the setting up of this council of workers and soldiers deputies. So we're seeing these councils spreading across Russia, and they're spreading across the army, and these councils within the army are taking charge of the weapons, and of course they're also challenging the authority of the officers. So military discipline, which Rodzianko promised the generals when he got the generals to force the Tsar to abdicate, he said that he would be able to restore order in the capital and establish an effective government, and that the parliament would take charge and would be able to prosecute the war effectively. It's now become clear that Rodzianko not only is unable to execute on that promise, but the first steps he has taken are causing the discipline of the army to disintegrate, and is creating alternative structures of power across Russia in the form of these councils to this government, the so-called government, which he and the other liberals and the oligarchs conjured up out of nothing when they got the Tsar to abdicate. So we see the result of Rodzianko's actions, and we see the results of the liberals' actions, and how the way in which they maneuver the Tsar's removal is already working out against them. Well, the result of all of this is that this government that now exists in St. Petersburg has very little control of the situation. The only disciplined organisation in St. Petersburg which still responds to the government effectively is the police. The government was frightened to send the police to the Finland station to arrest Lenin because they didn't know how the workers and the soldiers and this council that has now appeared would respond if Lenin was arrested. And the result is that it's clear that Russia has no effective government, that this whole government survives purely by bluff, and that it cannot take even the basic step of arresting someone like Lenin, who, as I said, has been in collusion with the country, Germany, with which Russia is at war, and who has arrived in St. Petersburg openly saying that he intends to overthrow the government. So we have no government in Russia. The whole system has collapsed. The liberals, the progressive bloc, the so-called progressive bloc in the Duma, Rodzianko, the oligarchs who run the economy, they've maneuvered feverishly to force the Tsar out, and without the Tsar, everything is unraveling at an incredible pace.
Right. Lenin understood this. Lenin understood this. He took a calculated risk, knowing that the chances that he would be arrested would be very, very low. And not only was he correct, but he has exposed to not only St. Petersburg, all of Russia, that there is no authority. There is no government ruling now. I mean, he's exposed that by the fact that he came to St. Petersburg via Germany, a country they're at war with.
Yes.
And he arrived with a hero's welcome.
Exactly.
And music and all of that. And he's also taken over a building to call it headquarters.
Absolutely.
So now he's running. He's running with the plan now. Period.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Why did Germany let him go? Why did Germany grant him this? Is there an understanding that they know Lenin is going to pull Russia out of the war, topple the government, just sow all kinds of chaos? I mean, this is a tactical, strategic maneuver from Germany.
That is exactly what the German intelligence community, the people who are probably running this weird character, Parvus, that's exactly what they imagine. They imagine that, Lenin will create chaos in Russia, which he will, by the way. I mean, this is an absolutely logical calculation, that he'll demoralize further the Russian army, impede Russia's war effort, and put Germany in a strategic position where it can win the war in the east, allowing Germany at that point to, having defeated Russia, to transfer its army against Russia to the west and defeat the French and the British. That's the plan. And as I said, they've been quietly supporting Lenin, helping Lenin for a while. I would say that Lenin knows this exactly, and it's not uncontroversial in Germany. The Kaiser, the Emperor, is known to have great misgivings about this policy. He thinks that playing this game with Lenin is an extremely dangerous one, and he's extremely concerned that the clever people in the German intelligence community haven't really worked this out properly and haven't thought it through. And perhaps, yes, you will create a revolution in Russia, but that this could create problems for Germany and for Europe further down the line. And it's known that it's not just the Kaiser himself who worries about this. There are other people across the German government, especially in the foreign ministry, who are extremely concerned about this, and also within the German security services. Apparently there's worries that, this revolutionary infection that has now taken hold in Russia which Lenin, once Lenin is in Russia, is going to get much stronger, that it's going to go viral, that it's going to spread to Germany itself, that this is an extremely unwise and reckless policy, and that this isn't really going to play out in the end to Germany's advantage. But those people were overruled. The dominant political force in Germany at the moment is the General Staff. It's the military. They run the intelligence services. They have an extremely narrow outlook. They see everything from the perspective of winning military victory. They don't look, if you like, beyond that. And that's perhaps unsurprising. I mean, that's the kind of focus that war forces on you. And they overruled the emperor, who has the Kaiser, who has only limited control over them. They overruled the interior ministry, the security people within Germany itself, and they gave the green light via Parvus for Lenin to transfer to Russia across Germany. So the Germans are using Lenin. Lenin is using the Germans. I think that's an important thing to say. I mean, there's people who say that Lenin is a German agent. That seriously underestimates Lenin, in my opinion. I think it assumes that Lenin is somebody who's easily used by other people. Lenin uses people. He isn't used by them. He's carried out this alliance of convenience with the Germans, which he will persist with as long as it suits him. When he gains control of Russia, which, by the way, I think is highly likely, then, of course, the Germans may find that he's not quite as accommodating to them as they imagine. And yes, he may work with them up to a certain point, but he has his own agenda, which is distinct from theirs. As I said, the Kaiser, I think, senses this and understands this. Others in Germany don't.
All right. So, what do you think Lenin's game plan is now that he's in St. Petersburg? How's he going to go about this takeover that he's talking about? And also, real quick, where is the Tsar? Where is he? What's going on?
Well, let's deal with where the Tsar is. He is at the moment in his palace, Tsarskoye Selo. This is an enormous palace complex just outside St. Petersburg, and he's there with his family. And he's there under guard. It's not quite clear whether he's under arrest or not, but that is where he is. And the talk is that the provisional government, which is supposed to be the government of Russia, or claims it's the government of Russia, and which the generals recognize or were tricked into recognizing as the government of Russia, and which the embassies, the foreign embassies, still pretend is the government of Russia, that this government is trying to negotiate with the British the terms of Nicholas's exile in London and the exile of the imperial family. The British are dragging their heels about that, by the way, and that's a complicated and rather unattractive story. But anyway, that's where Nicholas is. He is out of the picture. And it seems that he is now very, very unhappy about the fact that he was tricked into abdicating. He realizes that, he was misinformed by Rodzianko, the generals, and all the rest. He now deeply regrets what he did. And he even apparently sought legal advice before he was transferred to Tsarskoye Selo, while he was still in Mogilov, about whether or not he could actually withdraw his abdication. But of course, by that point, it was too late to do that. The politics of it would have made that impossible. It would have been impossible to go back on the decision to abdicate that he had made. Anyway, he's in Tsarskoye Selo. His wife is with him. The empress is with him. The children are all with him. And they're there under guard. And they're not apparently allowed to see anybody except a small number of servants and their doctor.
Can you just expand a little bit for the viewers why it's a little messy with Britain? What's the reason?
Yeah. Well, this is what is becoming really rather disturbing because, of course, Nicholas is, of course, a relative of the King of Britain, King George V. And Nicholas also has large private assets in Britain. He was allowed by the British to open a bank account with the Bank of England. Now, very, very few private individuals are given the privilege of having a bank account with the Bank of England. But Nicholas has, I mean, bear in mind, up to the point of his abdication, Nicholas's private wealth as Tsar of Russia may have made him the richest individual in the world. He has vast assets, and perfectly legitimately, this is the family wealth built up over centuries. He put some of this money in this account in the Bank of England. Now, I'm going to say something about Nicholas here, because, of course, Nicholas did that. He had this money in the Bank of England. At the same time as he did that, he gave instructions to all the other aristocrats and members of the imperial family that they should repatriate their money at the beginning of the war, that they should repatriate their money to Russia. Many of them very unwisely did that. So all these Russian aristocrats who had accounts in London and Paris and Switzerland closed their accounts and transferred their money to Russia. And of course, if they have to leave Russia and they can't take their money with them, they may find when they get to the West that they're short of funds. But anyway, Nicholas didn't do that. His finance minister, a man called Peter Bach, made sure that this account in London was still operating. Well, that was on the assumption, that he would still be able to access that money when the war ended. Nicholas never, I think, intended to leave Russia, but the provisional government wants him to go to Britain. It seems the King George V, is refusing to let him come. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why this is, why the King is refusing to allow his cousin Nicholas, who he physically resembles to an extraordinary degree, to come. There's been some suggestions that there's ill feeling between the two, but there's others who say that the King is extremely worried about his own position in Britain, which I find bizarre, by the way, if it's true, and that the King is worried that if Nicholas comes, he will in some way taint the King himself, and that might lead to demands from British workers that the King himself abdicate. I find that a crazy idea. I think it's a paranoid claim. I mean, the situation in Britain is as different from Russia as it's possible to get, but it is indisputable that it is the King who is apparently resisting suggestions that Nicholas and his wife and the children should come to Britain. And it's not entirely clear why, and maybe one day in 100 or 200 years, when the Royal Archives in London are opened, we will get a proper understanding of the reasoning behind all of this. In the meantime, this large amount of money in the Bank of England, it's unclear what the British are going to do about it.
Wow, incredible. Okay, Lenin. Let's get to Lenin. What's his? What do you think his game plan is now?
This is the thing about Lenin. I mean, the one thing about Lenin is that he is utterly straightforward about what he intends to do. On arriving in St. Petersburg, he spoke to the leaders of the Bolshevik party. He then addressed a core group, a caucus of this new council of workers and soldiers deputies, and he made a speech which he's now written up in something that he calls the April Theses. He loves to, give this impression that he is some kind of, this is all some kind of Marxist analysis of the situation, a kind of if you like, academic analysis of the situation in St. Petersburg, but of course, and in Russia, but of course, in reality, it sets out his political program. And provision number 3, no support for the provisional government. That's Article 3. Those are his words. No support for the provisional government. The utter falsity of all its promises should be made clear, particularly of those relating to renunciation of annexations. And that this is a bourgeois government. And then he goes on to say, not a parliamentary republic. To return to a parliamentary republic from the Council of Workers' Deputies would be a retrograde step, but a republic of councils of workers, peasants, deputies throughout the country from top to bottom. I'm again reading from him. That's clause 5, and clause 5 also goes on to say abolition of the police, the army and the bureaucracy. Note abolition of the police. And then clause 6, he's setting out his programme: confiscation of all landed estates, nationalisation of all land in the country, to the land to be dispossessed by the local councils of peasants, deputies, the organisation of councils to basically hold power. So he's quite clear what he wants to do. He wants to overthrow the provisional government. He wants these councils that, as I said, have been appearing all across the country to formally take power. He wants these councils to abolish the police, the one, as I said, institution in the country that retains certain amount of discipline. You know, abolish the police. Have you heard that somewhere else? He wants to abolish the police, and he wants all the landed estates to be confiscated, and essentially all the land to be confiscated. So he's absolutely clear about what he wants. I mean, that's the thing about Lenin. As I said, he's absolutely unambiguous, and of course he's now got the vehicle he needs to take power, because what he's saying is that these councils of workers and soldiers and peasants' deputies that are appearing across the country have more political legitimacy than the government has, because at least they are created from the grassroots by people in the factories and in the army units, and in some places from peasant collectives. Whereas, of course, the government, as I said, is simply a self-created thing. So he's actually got a point there, but he says that because of this, let's forget all about having, elections, parliaments, all that kind of thing, all that sort of thing. Let's have these councils take power, and he does that in the full knowledge that it is his organisation, the Bolshevik Party, that is playing a central role in forming these councils, and in the full expectation that through his organisation, he personally will be able to gain control of these councils and will be able to establish himself as the leader of Russia. So it's a straightforward programme. I mean, this is the thing about him. He is absolutely straightforward about what he intends to do. And it is electrifying. You can see that many of the soldiers and many of the workers in St. Petersburg, who have already been heavily influenced by the relentless propaganda that his organisation has been pumping out for years, they're absolutely electrified by all of this, because when Lenin says that these councils should take power, they're interpreting it to mean that they will take power. The workers and the soldiers will take power through these councils, whereas, of course, Lenin knows that because he's the person with the organisation, he will be able to control these councils, and it will ultimately mean power for him. So we can see that he has a clear agenda, a very clear policy, a strong organisation behind him. He's been gifted with these institutions, these councils, which, as I said, were in part provoked by these crass decisions that Rodzianko was taking after he got the Tsar to abdicate. And what he's up against, what Lenin is up against, is this decayed government, this essential non-government that no one appointed, that no one elected, that is pretending to the world that it is the government of Russia.
Right. just in closing, if I understand it correctly from what you read, Lenin's idea of government is confiscation of everything. In other words, people are not going to own
pretty
anything
much.
at all.
Pretty much,
Okay.
that seems to be his overall plan. So he says, I mean, in these so-called April theses, he said, well, we can't, move him directly towards socialism yet. The situation isn't ready, but essentially that's his ultimate plan. And there's talk, by the way, that he's also thinking of writing a massive theses. Lenin is one of these incredibly productive people. I mean, he churns out books and pamphlets at a rate that is almost beyond imagination. Anyway, he says that he's going to write a book. Apparently, he's going to, in the middle of all this activity, he's going to write a book. It's going to be called The State and Revolution, and he's going to outline the kind of vision of society that he thinks everyone should work towards, and it's one in which essentially there is no private property. Everything is going to be owned in common, and that's going to be the kind of society. Eventually, he does accept that things have to work towards some kind of progressive, there have to be steps towards achieving that. But that's the book apparently that he's going to work towards. In the meantime, when he talks about expropriating the land and expropriating the factories, of course, that's telling people, the peasants, the workers, that they will own the land and the factories. Remember, however, it will ultimately all be controlled through his organization. And of course, Lenin is saying that, the people who own the land and the factories, the factory workers, the factory owners, and the landowners, they are expropriating the labor of the peasants and the workers. And the slogan is expropriate the expropriators. So it's clear. It's something, as I said, that is cutting through, and it's straightforward. I mean, whatever you may think of it, it makes a refreshing difference to this, ocean of blather that you get from people like Rodzianko, Miliukov, Kerensky, and all the rest. Those liberal oligarchs who were allowing his organization to operate in the factories, those liberal politicians who were intriguing to bring the Tsar down, those people who were intriguing with the army, who were agitating in the Duma, they've now created a situation in Russia where Lenin is now in a position to act out all the things he's always wanted to do. And of course, his ultimate objective, as he's absolutely clear about this, is power. He even has made another speech in which he's actually said that the purpose of politics, this is a speech he's also made in St. Petersburg, it's another one of his so-called April theses. He says that the focus is on achieving state power, that without state power, nothing can be done, but with state power, everything becomes possible. He has that clarity of vision and that singleness of purpose that his opponents don't.
Yeah, we'll leave it there. State power, and they handed it to him.
And handing it to him in a plate. And note again, abolish the police.
Yeah. Abolish the police, confiscate property. And he's telegraphing all of this. I mean, there's nothing, he's not hiding any of this.
He's not making any secret of it. He's not making any secret of it at all.
Incredible. All right. Well, let's see. Let's see how this plays out. Okay, everybody, the Duran.locals.com. Take care.